Hey, Assalamu alaikum, Yunus. Hi, welcome. Assalamu alaikum. I would like to welcome everybody to our first installment of a webinar series for the month of Ramadan. I'll first say a few words about CIGA and what we're trying to accomplish with the webinar series before I hand over the floor to Dr. Sami Al-Arian. CIGA is the Center of Islam and Global Affairs at İZU, Istanbul Sabahattin Zaim University, based out of Istanbul. We focus on trying to analyze international affairs from the standpoint of the Muslim world. Therefore, the name of the center is the Center for Islam and Global Affairs. Over the past 2 years since its founding, CIGA has brought together a number of conferences on issues pertaining to the Muslim world and to the globe at large. We have also inaugurated a series of publications in which we are trying to give informed commentary on global affairs. Currently, the webinar series is a kind of experiment in crisis management to give our followers informed commentary and analysis in a sea of what seems to be unending facts and information overload regarding the state of the world as we live in. Part of this, part of the way that we remain uninformed is, and at a disadvantage these days, is because we are not able to organize and see each other, meet, and rely on certain institutions that we have been able to rely on during normal times. So CIGA is trying to bring together through our webinar series a platform for discussion on issues that pertain to all of us. Our first topic is on the concept of Tawheed, and it may seem a little unorthodox to begin with such an orthodox topic, especially pertaining to the crisis at hand. But I think part of the discussion that we've tried to instigate at CIGA is, can we think seriously and scientifically about concepts that are so foundational in our tradition, such as Tawheed or the Ummah, for instance, on which we have done a number of conferences in the past. I think there's a very strong kind of secular, modern approach to global affairs in which these kinds of concepts are seen as being unscientific. They have nothing to contribute. But in fact, Tawheed or Ilm al-Tawheed as it has been in the Muslim tradition. Very interestingly, the books in Ilm al-Tawheed have often ended on the question of imamah, right? So you start with the question about God, your theology, and you end on the question of imamah. And this isn't really, for those of us who study political theory and political history, these are not actually divorced from each other, these two issues, even though today we believe that, but that's not the case. And there's really intricate ways in which your theology interacts with the way your politics. But at the fundamental, I guess, issue of Tawheed is, does a world of transcendence really matter in analyzing politics and political issues? And this is the kind of topic that we want to kickstart the Ramadan series, even considering also that this is the month of Ramadan for many Muslims, 1.2 billion people in the world. So I think it's a relevant discussion to have as we go forward. Our first participant is Dr. Sami Al-Arian, who is the director of the Center of Islam and Global Affairs. He is also a widely sought after voice regarding international politics, especially hegemony, American leadership. He has been active in politics in the United States for many years, organizing on an all-American level, right? A national opposition against certain forms of injustice. He has also written on the subject in a number of publications. He regularly writes as a columnist in many forums and is invited to give his insights into the Muslim world and global affairs. I would like to turn over the floor to Dr. Sami Al-Arian. Welcome, Dr. Sami.
Thank you. Thank you very much, always. Thank you for your kind introduction, and thank you everybody for being with us and joining us. Ramadan Mubarak, and I wish that you will have a successful and blessed fasting for the month, and also for our friends throughout the world. Thank you for joining us, and I hope that you're staying safe and healthy. Our topic today, as always mentioned, is about Tawheed. Tawheed, as many Muslims know, is the basic principle of Islam. In Islamic theology, Islam means the total submission and surrender to the will of God. But what is the will of God? The will of God can only be known by God. He has to reveal it, he has to proclaim it, to divulge it to people. So in a nutshell, when we talk about Tawheed, it means to attest to the oneness of God, to his unique characteristics, to his unlikeness, to no other, to his unique otherness. I wouldn't want to discuss this topic as it's usually discussed in theology schools. They talk about what they call Tawhid al-Rububiyyah, or the unity of lordship, or Tawhid al-Uluhiyyah, the unity of worship, or Tawhid al-Isma' wal-Sifat. They talk about the unity of his names and attributes in a very abstract way. That's how it's been discussed and taught throughout centuries, where they talk about believers and those who are not believers and so on and so forth. My approach today is a bit different. I'd like to talk about Tawheed as an interrelationship between God and his creation. The essence of the message of God as it is understood through believers of many faiths, not just Muslims, because Islam was the last revealed religion, but Muslims also believe in the context of Tawheed that all religions were the same, all emanated from the same source, and therefore the same message. And this relationship, when we talk about the relationship between God and his creation, we talk about living things such as people, and also other non-living things, which is throughout the universe. So in this paradigm of Tawheed, when we talk about the Tawheed or the oneness of God, we talk about two realms. These two realms in the doctrine of Tawheed are totally separated. The God, what we may call God, and non-God. As Ismail Faruqi, the late Ismail Faruqi, may God rest his soul, may her soul rest in peace, called this the principle of duality. On one hand, you have God, who has infinite knowledge, ability, infinite power, mightiness, capacity, limitless capacity, mercy, compassion, bounty, generosity, dominion, total dominion. What we may call in Arabic, the al-ilm, al-qudra, al-quwwa, al-izza, al-rahma, al-rizq, al-mulk, all these concepts that I just mentioned are totally belong to him. They totally belong to him. In the non-God realm, we talk about the created versus the creator. We talk about the immanent versus the transcendent, who is God. God is sacred, and the non-God word is the non-sacred. God has the absolute power. God is the absolute. In the non-God, it's the relative. In God, in the realm of God, we talk about the infinite. In the realm of the non-God, we talk about the finite. In the realm of God, we talk about the unlimited. In the realm of the non-God, we talk about the limited. In the realm of God, we talk about the unique attributes. In the realm of non-God, we talk about the common characteristics. So of this system of the two realms is how we can distinguish between what we call the Tawheed, the total uniqueness of God, and the non-God. But because man's knowledge is limited and finite, man needs assistance in understanding and divulging the purpose of life, in realizing what the will of God might be, in knowing the answers to the many questions that people have about life, about death, about relationships, creation, nature, the forces of nature, moral behavior, about how we're supposed to live, the human nature, the nature of our mind, our soul, our body, the universe we live in, the system that organizes our lives, and so on and so forth. So the existence of one realm that provides infinite knowledge, or has infinite knowledge, and provides the infinite assistance and help that gives answers to these existential questions, the purpose of life, the purpose of creation, and that this is not in vain. This is the realm by which we need to understand, and we can only go to the source of that knowledge to understand that in the Tawhid doctrine, that people are born free, that it is part of the will of God is to provide human beings the capacity to believe in Him, to know Him, to choose or not to choose to obey Him, to follow His commandments, or even to totally ignore Him, deny Him, not believing in Him, defy Him, and defy His will. That has been given by God to people. So with that freedom comes responsibility and judgment, that there will be consequences to the choices of people and how they exercise that freedom. That will come with it a responsibility as well as a judgment, depending on how they choose to exercise that freedom. In the Tawhid doctrine, because God is infinite, He has infinite knowledge and power, and man is limited and finite, that there are also two worlds that exist side by side. In the Tawhid doctrine, we have the word of Shahada, meaning the word, the seen word, the witnessed word, where people can see, touch, sense, hear, discover, experience, live, things that they can immediately have a direct relationship to. The natural world, the physical world that we live in. But also there is another world, which is called the world of ghaib, the unseen, where we cannot see it, we cannot experience it, we cannot discover it. But this word can only be known to us, told to us, through the Creator, through the One who created both worlds, through God, in other words. That this can only be revealed, it cannot be discovered or known. So the believers in God, in Him, would understand many of His purposes, of His aspects, and the aspect of this word, of the unseen, by getting that knowledge directly from Him, the ones that He provides human beings this knowledge. And how is that conveyed? How is that knowledge conveyed? When we talk about the relationship between God and His creation, for those who believe in Him, He can only give it to us through two means: by sending messengers that tell us about this world of ghaib, about God's will, but also through the books, because men are mortal. So these prophets would come and go. They will be in the same communities and they will go. But when we talk about this being God's will that needs to be communicated to all people at all times, in all places, this also comes through books which are claimed to be God's words. Now, these books that communicate give us these two words: the word of the unseen and the word of the seen, the witnessed word. In the witnessed word, we understand that knowledge, this is the universe that we live in, that the knowledge is known or could be known. It could be discoverable, in other words. But in the world or the realm of the unseen, of al-ghaib, that knowledge is unknown, unknowable, and undiscoverable. So that means that we have to get that knowledge from its source. In the Tawheed doctrine, to understand means to read. The first verse in the Quran that God sent to humankind says, "Iqra bismi rabbika alladhi khalaq." Read in the name of thy Lord who created. In other words, it combined both the word of God, meaning revelation, telling us this particular knowledge, the source of that knowledge, and then talks about creation and created. We're talking about things that people can see, can sense, can discover. The physical world. So to gain knowledge, to discover truth, to know facts, to understand natural or physical laws, we call nature, to understand our universe, our environment, is to seek knowledge. But because there are two worlds, the world of the seen and the world of the unseen, then we cannot, by definition, know both unless we are assisted by God. Therefore, to understand and know the divine will of God, then we need to combine the two readings. This is a concept that was given to us or taught to us in the word of Sudanese philosopher Muhammad Abul Qasim Haj Hamad, as well as in the many writings of Dr. Taha Jabir al-Alwani, the combination to combine both readings. The reading of the universe, which he called Alam al-Shahada, and the reading of Wahi, of revelation. That these two sources, the reading of the universe and the reading of revelation, must be combined in order to understand and divine God's will. The reading of the revelation tells us a lot about God, about the unseen world that we cannot discover. And the reading of the universe tells us a lot about the universe that we live in and the many laws that are under the creation of the universe. So we combine these two readings, that there is an implicit acknowledgement of that Tawheed doctrine. When we combine these two readings, what we have here is an interrelationship between three entities. And if we imagine a triangle with three indices, at the top of that index, we have God. And then in the bottom, we have two indices that are related with a line, as in a triangle. On one, we have man, and in the other, we have universe. So what we have here is an interrelationship between three entities, God, man, and universe. In that sense, then we need to understand the relationship between these three entities, the relationship between God and man, the relationship between man and man, the relationship between man and universe, and between God and the universe. Now, this is, in essence, the concepts or in the paradigm of Tawheed, and also the essence of what was called Islamic civilization throughout history. We can know a lot about it in many scholarly works, including Dr. Sayyid Hussein Nasr and others, about the essence of Islamic civilization, Dr. Taha Jabir al-Alwani, and many others. But what is the relationship in that figure, in that construction between God and man? That relationship is based on Tawheed. And the relationship between man and man, so it's like having a feedback loop. What is the relationship in that system between man and man is based on tazkiyah, to purify one's soul, physical nature, spiritual nature, and so on and so forth. This is how a person can purify himself and purify that relationship with his fellow man. The relationship between man and universe is based on what is called Imran, building, developing, discovering, constructing the world. not to destroy the world. That there are rules that are bounding this relationship that people cannot transgress. They cannot just use whatever happens by constructing their own rules that will deny the rules that God set on earth. The relationship between God and the universe is based on the concept of taskhir, meaning subjugation, that God created this universe with certain laws, with certain ways that it will function according to the will of God, and therefore the universe cannot defy, cannot get outside the many laws that we have, from the law of gravity to the electromagnetics, or all the things, the sickness and the healthiness and so on and so forth. All these things that God created, He put in the universe that can be discovered, can be known, and that they will have to revolve around that these laws that God put on earth, not despite of God or in spite of God, but because of the will of God. These are what we call the natural laws, and these are discoverable. So, to summarize this, then we talk about these three indices in that system, with the relationship between God and man based on Tawheed, between man and man based on tazkiyah or purification, between man and universe based on Imran or building and constructing, and between God and the universe by creating that universe and make it available to be controlled according to the rules and regulations that God put in place for it. So God then would reveal Himself to the human beings through both revelation and His creation, the universe that He created. This word, this concept, this doctrine, when we talk about the Tawheed, it has its own moral paradigm, its own ethical system, ethical behavior, moral code, because it is God-centered, and God explains that through the way that He communicates to people, whether through the living prophets, the lives of the prophets, or through the books that He gives to people, which explains how He wants people to live. So when we talk about that, we talk about guidelines for moral behavior and life. That is contrasted with the non-Tawheed realm. In the non-Tawheed realm, we no longer have the three indices. What we have is one line. The third aspect is missing. That one line has two indices, man and universe. The God part of it is totally removed. And that relationship then is based on the capacity of man to subjugate the universe, the world. That world is still subject to God's laws and power, but it's man's attempt to subjugate that universe, to make it under his dominion. Now, that man could be under his understanding of what the purpose of that is, of what dominion is. It could be for good or bad or evil, how to understand it, how to use desires or whims, unguided by anything, because it is man who would decide now how they will subjugate the universe, how they will subjugate the world according to their will. So these are the two systems that distinguish. One has the Tawheed system where God is the center, it's a God-centered world, and one is the total absence of God-centered, even though it's His creation. And it is God that gave people the ability to exercise that free will, to choose whether they want to live in a God-centered world, the way He wants to have His will applied on earth, or the choice of man through the exercise of free will, not to live that world and to choose to be the master, or at least to attempt to be the master of the universe by trying to subjugate that universe according to man's power, understanding, knowledge, desire, or whims. But here we, regardless of how, and I think in the current crisis that people live in now throughout the world, with billions of people are held up at home, is that we still know now that our knowledge is still very, very limited. We cannot even get control over a virus that is 1 nanometer. You know, when you have 1 billion of them come together, you can hardly get 1 meter. So if whether man thinks that he's capable of mastering, of subjugating, of taking total control and dominion of the universe, as we are reminded over and over that this is a very difficult task to have. Man wants to do, decide, desire, decree, or divine the whole world according to his will. It's very difficult regardless. But yet, people throughout history who did not acknowledge God's dominion, God's ability, God's power, God's existence, have chosen to do that, which is their right to do that. God gave them that right. So what we have now is 2 words: the word of Tawheed, which is God-centered, God-created, and guided by God's code, and we have the word of non-Tawheed, which is man-centered, guided by man's code, which could be, as I said, for the benefit of man, or the benefit of some, or the benefit of none at all, because it depends on purely subjective matters according to the people who hold that power. In the word of Tawheed, we also understand the story of creation. It provides us answers to many questions, especially the question of why. Why are we created? What is the purpose of creation? And because of the time limitations, I'm unable to go through the many stories and reasons of what it is, especially from an Islamic perspective in the realm of Tawheed, but I will try to be brief. In the story of creation, God created man and gave him free will, as I said earlier, complete free will to exercise it as they wish. But with that came responsibility, and with that also comes judgment. In the universe, we have the natural laws, the created, the conceived, the constructed, and was set in motion by God. In the realm of man, man has the capacity. When God created man, gave him the capacity to change and conform, to develop as well as to destroy, to surrender as well as to defy and deny. In the realm of the universe, the ability to be discovered, to be subjugated, to be understood, to bring it under control. And here we're talking about what we call nature, to discover it. So in both instances, God set some conditions as well as some laws, and he regulated this through giving man the total free will to choose how they want to live. But in this world also, there is no original sin. So man is born free, and it is their action, it's his action or her action, that will determine how they will be judged. They are born free, so they have the capacity to sin, to aggress, to commit aggression, that is, to go beyond the permissible, to cross boundaries, and that they will have to face the consequences. In that world, then, for justice to prevail, that means there will have to be a different system. There has to be not just this world, because having just this world, there is no judgment day, then that means that it is up to man to decide whether they have a moral code, an ethical behavior, or not. But in the principle of Tawheed, it is implicit, and it is part and parcel of the fact that justice dictates that this life is not the end life, not the only life. It is transitory life in which there will have to be another life where judgment would take place, where people's actions would be judged, their choices would be judged. Now, again, because of time limitation, I'm trying to be brief a bit here. When we talk about this relationship, the interrelationships between God and man, God and universe, and man and universe, there are 9 principles that regulate that relationship. 5 pertain to the relationship between God and man, and 2 between man and universe, and 2 between man and man. As far as the relationship between God and man, when we talk about the 5 relationships, and all these are Quranic principles, so that's how we understand, because God, as I said, reveals himself to us through his creation by 2 readings. One reading is the reading of the universe. We know a lot about God's creation by reading that universe, by understanding that universe, by discovering these creatures. But also there are many things that we may not get except from the revelation, from the communication that God does with us. And that's through his book and the last revealed book. So all these is the Quran. So I'm giving all these concepts come from reading the Quran, trying to understand these relationships between God and man, and so on and so forth. So as far as these principles that come between the relationship between God and man, we talk about 5 principles that come from the Quran. The first is the concept of istikhlaf, and I'm going to use the Arabic words because it's very difficult to encompass all the meanings that come with these Quranic words. These are very rich, very in terms of linguistics, they have a lot of meanings. So I will try to translate to the best I can when it comes, but I will also be using the Arabic terms so that it can have all this richness with it. The first relationship, or the first principle between the relationship between God and man, is the concept of istikhlaf. Sometimes it is translated as vicegerent, the person who can take over, that someone gives someone the ability to take over certain things, in other words, being a representative. And here there are many verses in the Quran that talks about this concept, where God started with Adam, but also throughout his progeny, his children, is that God made man as being the representative, being the vicegerent on this earth, being the person who can actually bring all creatures under his control. This is something that was given by God. And a person has the ability to spread goodness as well as mischief. Actually, I don't want to digress too much, but I don't think there is actually a conflict between Darwin's theory, which talks about the theory of evolution, and the theory of creation. I think in Islam we do not have this conflict, because we do not say that God is only creating one aspect. God has many manifestations of creation. It is possible, and the Quran actually alludes to this, that there may have been some creation at one point that went through the different levels of evolution, but at one point God decided to also create another type of creation that started with Adam. And that's where, there's a story in Surah Al-Baqarah in chapter 2, where there is this dialogue taking place between God and the angels, in which he says that I wanted to prostrate to this man, and they come and said, we're not going to obviously defy or deny, but isn't this the same created entity that goes and spread mischief and blood? So they were looking at something that was taking place, probably something that came through evolution, and that went up to the ape man, what is called the ape man, something that resembled man, but they did not have the faculties by which they can actually have this free will. And the angels, because they didn't have the knowledge, they were just questioning whether this was a manifestly good creation, but God told them yes, and he demonstrated that by showing the faculty of Adam, the fact that he has knowledge and he has mind, and he has been honored. And that's when they did, while Satan defied that order, that commandment from God. In other words, we do not have this problem, because we do not say that man's life, it's been only 6,000 years or whatever, other books may say. So it's very well be, but even in Darwin's theory, we're told that he reached what is called the missing link. Okay, he went all the way until the ape man, and then he doesn't know how he went from ape man to man. Well, Actually, we didn't. We stopped at 8 men, but what happens here is that it was a different kind of creation that came from a different process, not the process of evolution, the process of be and he was, and this is what God made us on earth, which is different, and we've been honored with the faculties of our minds, of our choices, of our free will, of the ability to understand and make decisions. So here, this is the story that we started with creation and with the istikhlaf, that this that man was given this choice, was given the ability, the capacity to understand God, to know God, to believe in God, to surrender to God, to commit, to submit, and also the ability to defy and totally reject. And with that comes the consequences, as I said. So for those who will take the path of faith, the path of doing good, the path of trying to live according to the will of God, they will be judged one way. And for those who take a different route, they will be judged differently. But either way, God has given man the ability to be on earth, to live on earth, and to be the vicegerent, to be a representative, either good or bad. And there are many, of course, concepts, but again, because of time, I have to move on. The second concept about that relationship, about that the regulation of the relationship between man and God, is that God honored man. And how did God honor man? He gave him dignity. This is what called the concept of takrim. And God, in many instances, in many verses in the Quran, talks about وَلَقَدْ كَرَّمْنَا بَنِي آدَمَ, that God honored the children of Adam. How did he honor us? With the faculty of mind, with the faculty of choice, of the faculty of free will, of the faculty of being able to think and know and grow and develop and be good people, as well as by not following a certain path, by digressing and being even the worst of human beings. So again, in many verses, we talk about how God tests people to know the essence of their character. They could be dignified, in which they would be rewarded, or they could be undignified, by which case they will be punished. And that's a major difference between even the men and angels, because God created 3 different creatures, men from clay, angels from light, jinn from fire. And angels didn't have this faculty. They don't have this ability to make choices. They would just have to follow in God's commandments. And but man has that ability to defy and to reject and to totally ignore what God wants. And then God says that the best among you, the most honored among you, are those who fear God, who believe in Him. The third relationship, the third regulation of that relationship between that God gave to man, is the relationship, is the concept of amana, what I would translate as responsibility. And here God tells us in the Quran that He gave that responsibility, He offered that responsibility to the most dominating creatures that He has, the creation, the heavens, the earth, the mountains, and all of them. And of course, these are different ways that we may not understand, because this has come again from the word of ghaib, the word of the unknown, of the unseen, that they wouldn't take that responsibility because it's a heavy responsibility, but man has taken that responsibility. And because of his ignorance, of his limitations, dalum and jahula, of his inability to understand it. Yet we can get to the point where we can carry that amana, carry that responsibility, that trust. God offered that trust, that responsibility, that amana. Those creatures refuse to take it. Man has taken it. Now, we understand from the Quran that also there are 4 types of worlds that we go through. The world of atoms before we're born, the world of the living after we're born, the world of barzakh, this inner state where our souls is stored until the day of judgment, where we are joined by it again. So these are the 4 different stages of our life. This is not just one shot life that we hear this word. We come before that word, in the word, in between the words, and the last word. So these are 4 different words that we live in, and during that phase of our life, when we were in the alam al-dhar, in the atom's life, we were given that amana, and we took it, we agreed to it, and we give testimony, we give witness that we are going to submit to God, and then we made a different choice. This is what is called the fitra, the natural way we're born with. Okay, so the people could change in life, but this is the nature that we're living with. The fourth principle is the principle again of this relationship is the principle of ibtila. Ibtila means trial, means test, that we are, because of this innate nature that we are born with, which is the ability to make these choices, and that's why we're held responsible. Then God is going to test us. He is going to give us all kinds of different things in our life to see whether what we proclaim, whether good or bad, whether we are true to this. In chapter 29, God starts by saying, do people think that they will be left saying that we believe and that not being tested, that they will be tested as they have been tested, as those who have been tested before them, so that those who are true to their faith will be known, and those who are not true will be exposed. And that in another verse, God says that God created life and death so that he can be tested, that we can be tested to see who will do the best deeds. So trials and tests basically gives us the essence and tells us about the capacity of man to withstand these different pressures, these different tests, these different trials and tribulations. And by that, we grow, we change, we conform, we become better people, or the opposite. We retreat, we disbelieve, we become desperate, we become doubtful, we become suspicious, we lose our faith. It is that we have the capacity to grow in one area, we have the capacity to also to regress. In either way, this is part of life because we are given that ability to exercise our free will. The fifth principle, and this is the last one I'm going to talk about this relationship between God and man, is that the reason, the purpose of life is that of ibadah, what we may call worship. But here, when we talk about devotion and worship, we do not talk about it in the secular sense. In the secular sense, or even in the minds of some people, when they talk about worship, they think that when they pray and fast and pray charity and do pilgrimage, and this is worship. But in Islam, in the paradigm of Tawheed, worship means that every act of the human being is considered worship. Every single act, even the act of things that people may not consider acts of or have to do with anything to do with God or religion. Procreation, sexual relationship between husbands and wives, and so on and so forth. Even these could be considered in the realm of Tawheed, in the world of Tawheed, as being acts of worship. In other words, every waking moment of a human being could be considered as an act of worship. Why? Because if they are doing it according to the will of God, then it becomes part of their devotion towards God. It becomes part of their worship towards God. However, every single thing that is done in defiance of God's will, then it could be considered as something that you have taken as an associate to God, as someone who is more worthy of what God does, of what God wants us to do. So that's the concept of association, which is contrary to the concept of Tawheed. So to be a person who is applying the concept of Tawheed in our lives, that means every waking moment you're trying to do things the way God wants us. Now, we are human beings. Certainly we're going to make mistakes. Certainly we regret these mistakes. And that's why God is the most forgiving. That God would forgive us, but there's still a standard. There's still an ideal that we can follow, that we can try to live by this moral ethical code, which is the way that we approach things according to God's will. And that's the whole concept of ibadah. That this is how we truly submit to God. This is how we truly worship him, not simply by these mechanical ways that we do it, just simply go and pray and do wudu, ablution and fast and abstain from drink and food and sexual relations and all that. That's only part of it. but the total submission, the total Tawheed, that means every waking moment of a human being, he remembers, she understands that this relationship is an eternal, is an existing. It's not a relationship that is controlled by space or time, but it is an eternal relationship. That's the whole concept of worship then. That, and all depends on the intention of that person. You know, you could make mistakes, but if your intention was good, then depending on that mistake, God would forgive that mistake and will learn from these mistakes and will move on, and he will give you even rewards for having a good intention. So these are the five, what I would call the five principles that regulate the relationship between God and man, and simply they are, again, to reiterate, istikhlaf, takrim, amana, ibtila, and ibadah, meaning, you know, being the representative, the vice regent of God on earth, being honored and dignified, having the responsibility and the trust that God gives you, that we will be tested, and according to that test there will be a consequence, and that the relationship must be based on ibadah, on total worship and submission to God. Now, the relationship, the next one is the relationship between man and universe. So we did the man and God, now man and universe. There are two principles that regulate, that control that relationship. One is the principle of taskhir, of subjugation, that, as I said earlier, God made the universe, these creatures, this creation, this whole universe, you know, the laws of earth that we live in, the natural laws, the physical laws, the gravity, electromagnetic, nuclear, all the different things, wind, sea, and so on and so forth, all these earthquakes, volcanoes, all these laws, he has made them available to us to understand them, to discover them, to make use of them, or to avoid them, depending on the circumstance. In other words, it is the ability to subjugate this earth, this universe, this world to man's control and will is available. In the Quran, there are dozens and dozens of verses talks about the subjugation of the sun, of the moon, of the night, of the day, of the seas, of the rivers, of the mountains, of the wind, and so on and so forth. That all these manifestations of creations of God, all of them are available to be at the service of man, to be understood and to be used. So that's the thing, that the weak man can, despite that man is the weakest, one of the weakest creatures that God created, yet God gave us the ability through the exercise of our faculty of mind, that we have that ability to subjugate everything. A man can control the lion, even though the lion is infinitely more powerful than man, yet we can subjugate the lion. But not only that, but even many other creatures. But once in a while, God would also remind a person that this was done because God made it so. So he would remind us by sending us messages in which to say that you're still weak. And the only reason that man is able to do this is because God permitted him to do so. Today, we are living in such a message that despite how man progressed and was able to subjugate everything on earth to his service, yet a virus that cannot even be seen is taking control of the whole world, that devastated the whole world, to the point that you know the world is paralyzed. It is unprecedented what we see today in history because of this message that God said that all of you are under my control, and I can make the weakest among you being to supersede your power. So this is God, the concept of taskhir, of subjugation, then becomes important. The second principle about which is the seventh, but the second between man and universe, is the concept of tamkeen, which means establishing control and authority and power on earth. That God gave this ability, the ability of us to basically having the power and authority. And there are two kinds of dominion and power. One is the ability to rule over in a legitimate way. So there are two kinds of dominion and power: an ability to rule over other people, the universe, we can do it in a legitimate way, in an acceptable way. But for that, God tells us that there are two conditions that must exist for this to take place. That there has to be faith and belief and surrender and submission to the will of God, and that it has to be done in a righteous way, in what the Quran calls the straight path, or the good deeds, or what's called al-birr wa taqwa, the righteousness and piety and fear of God. That's a legitimate way when people can take control. But there is also a non-legitimate way, or the wrong way, or the way of aggression, which is taking power through aggression. And this is the Quran terms as al-ithm wal-udwan, committing sins and aggression. And God says that what you have to do as human beings is to cooperate for birr and taqwa, for righteousness and piety and fear of God, and to abstain and do not cooperate in making evil deeds and aggression and sins and so on and so forth. So the concept of tamkeen is available, and it is the choice of man how they want to exercise it. We can take over the universe and destroy it with global warming and other kinds of things, or we can take it and preserve it and try to make it better the way it was given and handed to us. And there is an important, of course, verse in this, and we can again, because of lack of time, but it talks about how the people, when they are given that authority, given that dominion, given that power and control on earth, they established what's good, the prayers, the charities, the commanding what's good and forbidding what is evil, and helping others, and so on and so forth. There is a particular verse in Surah Al-Baqarah about the meaning of birr, and it is so beautiful that I think when people read it, they can see all manifestations, all aspects of what is the relationship between man and universe, and the people at large, that this is the type of relationships that God wants to see, and with that, God gives that establishing power. So these laws, these sunan, these ways that are available, and it is up to the people's choices to choose. And when good people do not take over by following God's ways of having societies and relationships, then the other people will. There is no vacuum. The other people will take over, and they will impose their own rules, which could be contrary to God's ways of life. The last two, and I'm trying to end here probably because of the time limitation, is the relationship between man and man. There are two principles. We talk about 5, man and God, 2, man and universe, and there are 2 principles that will define the relationship between man and man. The first is the concept of tadafu', and this is one of the most difficult words to translate, actually. It comes from Surah, again, chapter 2, talks about that people will have this relationship. Again, the word tadafu' comes from the root word where people could be shoving and pushing and defending themselves, and there is some kind of an engagement between the people. And God says, if it wasn't for Allah to have people that can check the power of other people, then the whole earth, the whole life would be destroyed. It would be there would be mischief, and this is part of the bounty, part actually of the mercy that God creates, this possibility for people to engage, that the evil will never be just always victorious, but evil sometimes will be resisted and will be faced with good people who will try to defeat it, because they have different ways of seeing things. They follow God's commandments. So if Allah didn't check, so I would put it in the realm of the translation of the check. Allah made people check other people's power. It's like balance. To balance it, when you have bad people, then God would get other people, will allow other people to go and check the power of these people by means of another. Then the earth indeed would be full of mischief. That didn't take place. So this is the concept of tadafu', to have a check on the bad behavior, on the immoral and unethical behavior of some, the aggression of some, by having other people who are willing to stand up to these people and push them away, shove them away, end them and their evilness and resist that oppression. It is that concept that determines the relationship between man and man. So if you have a Pharaoh, you always have Moses. If you have Quraysh with its evil ways, you have Prophet Muhammad and his companions. If you have evil standing up and trying to take over, always there will be other people who are willing to go, and they may actually with that pay the ultimate sacrifice by giving up their own lives, because they are trying to sacrifice for something higher than themselves. The last principle about people here, and this is the again between man and man, is the principle of witnessing. What is told in the Quran is shuhud, that somebody is witnessing. Now, when you act as a witness, basically you are presenting yourself as someone who is telling the truth, someone who is a means to seeing something and getting that something to the public. You are a witness. If you witness a crime, you come and you say what you did, what you saw, what you witnessed actually. And here the Quran says again in chapter 2, verse 143, that the mission that God sent to the people, to the righteous people that he chose, is that he wants them to be a balanced community, and that they will be witnesses over mankind. Why? Because to be a witness, that you have to have certain characteristics. You cannot be a witness unless you are a truthful person, an honest person, someone who adheres to the truth, someone who is very careful about knowing what the truth is and then giving it and then telling it as it is. So God says that part of humanity, part of that relationship between people would be, there will be some communities, there will be some people who will act as witnesses, so no one could come and claim otherwise, claim that we didn't know, that we didn't, no one told us anything, that we were ignorant. No, there were some people who would come and give that witness, that shahada, that testimony, in which it would say what God intended, what God wanted, and no one could claim otherwise. This is a very important function of people, and people could choose whether they want to be part of that community who can testify, or part of the community that can claim ignorance, or actually do evil deeds and think that he can get away with it. Now, just to summarize, and then we can move to questions and answers, since we have about only a couple of minutes, is what we talked today about is this concept of this paradigm of Tawheed in the context of God being unique, that there is a word of God, and everything else aside from God becomes in the other realm. So this is best. So anything that's going to take an attribute, or takes a characteristic, or takes any kind of meaning that only involves God, then that will break this concept of Tawheed. So we have to separate this totally, and that's the complete concept of Tawheed. Everyone else cannot come close to taking the total attributes of God. And second is that there is a relationship, there is a paradigm in the Tawheed doctrine, in which there is a relationship that is regulated between God, man, and universe, and that we have to understand these relationships. While in the non-God, in the non-transcendental tradition, is that is a linear relationship that only has man and universe, and it is central. It's man-centered, because the universe is basically subjugated to the laws of God, while man is limited by some things that God put. He has the capacity to digress, to aggress, to do whatever he wants, and that capacity gives him the ability to subjugate the earth according to his desires and whims, which could be in conformation with God or in defiance of God. And thirdly, is that the principal relationship then becomes Tawheed between God and man, Tazkiyah man to man, Imran, or building, when we talk about man and universe. And with that, we come to the concept of harmony. This is how God wants people to live in harmony between man and their relationship to their creator and to their universe. Thank you very much, and we'll move, if you like, to the questions and answers.
Thank you very much, Dr. Sami, for your very enlightening lecture. I had some comments that I wanted to share with our viewers. However, there was many questions that were sent in over the live Q&A during your talk, so I will move to kind of in ventriloquist fashion voice their questions on their behalf, and then you can answer them one by one. I will just ask them in the order that they were received. Number one, someone asked, what are some resources that we can follow up on, especially on this concept of Tawheed that you have explained, where one can go and read more about and consult to get more information?
You want to go one by one or a bunch of questions?
That's kind of a separate question, so
okay.
If you could just answer that one and then.
Well, of course, I mean, one of the best books that address this topic is by Ismail Farouqi. It's called Tawheed. But the concepts I presented are not necessarily in that book, even though it generally speaking, it talks about 5 different principles that, you know, that define according to his understanding what Tawheed is, including the concept of duality, the concept of responsibility and judgment, and so on. It's a very good book. Most of the things that I put together was throughout my reading, so I have this approach. But also, you could use many of the books by Dr. Taha Jaber Al-Alwani. Many of his books are in Arabic, but many also were translated in English. And he actually addressed this in a very profound way, some of these concepts. You can go also back to some of other writings like Muhammad Iqbal and others that they talk about this in a very Ali Shari'at and others, in Hassan al-Turabi in his book Al-Iman. There are these many books that then can put Tawheed in a different realm rather than just a very rigid things about, you know, that you can find in the classical books. These things are very important, but they were written more to scholars and to make sure that we have this study of theology. But I would like to approach Tawheed in the way we read the Quran. The Quran does not come and give us, you know, the 1, 2, 3s of things, and the Quran gives us the living way of how our relationship or how Muslims and the believer relationship should be between him and God and him and the universe and so on and so forth. So that's basically my approach.
Thank you. So I will ask, there's a number of questions that are coming in now also as we speak. You know, there's a very classical question in what we call philosophy of religion called the tension between predestination versus free will. I think someone raised this question. That's something maybe you can touch on. Another issue that is also very common in philosophy of religion is God's pre-knowledge, and how do we? Someone asked. Now I'm not precisely sure I understand the question, so I'll ask it as it was received. What is the status of knowledge derived from true human nature, parentheses, primordial fitra, in understanding God, universe, and himself? Its status in defining our relation with 3 entities. Does it work independently? So I think they're asking, what is the role of knowledge in understanding this triangular relationship that you explained? And lastly, as a third question, actually, I'll save that one because that's on a little bit of a different topic. So maybe you can answer these 2 regarding philosophy of religion and the concept of Tawheed.
I mean, obviously, two questions are related. When we talk about free will, we're talking about this is something that God gave. It's not in spite of God. God gave us the human being the ability to exercise their free will. They can exercise it in a good way, in a way that God wants it to be exercised, or in a different way. But that's not it. That's what God gave us. So it comes with that also. You can say that there are certain things that we can control. There are certain things I cannot control. So when free will comes judgment and responsibility, but Judgment and responsibility only will come to those things that I exercise my free will. I did not exercise my free will, for instance, to be a male, or to be born in a particular geography or in a particular country, or to speak a particular language, or to come from a particular social class, or to be educated, uneducated. All these things, sometimes there are certain things that I certainly can claim responsibility for, and there are certain things I can't. You know, if you have genetics, certain genetics within you, this is something that you can't control, and therefore it's only just that we will only be held accountable to the things that we have control over. And that's the way I understand free will. Free will is what I could exercise, in which case I control. If I cannot control, that's why in the Islamic religion, things that you do not control, you will not be held responsible for. Very simple, because that's what justice dictates. On the question of state of knowledge, I'm not going to take too much time. It's a philosophical question, certainly, but it's very important to know that we do not know the knowledge of God, and therefore you cannot judge, you know, whether that knowledge was given in a way that would be accepted or not accepted. Most people who would criticize this concept would come from the point of making certain judgments, but we don't know. Yes, God knows, because that's His nature, that's His attribute. But we do not know. Since we do not know, we can choose. God knows, for instance, you know, it's like, let me give you an example. And of course, God is the best example. If you are a designer of a car and you put its hardware and software in place, you would know that if that person takes the wrong direction or does the wrong thing, this is what's going to happen with that car. And that person, you know, he may or may not know, but it's him who is making that decision, you know, to speed or not to speed, to take a right turn or a left turn, or to do whatever they want. But as a designer of that, you know exactly what's going to happen. And it's even more profound than that, because I know that nature of that person, and I know that person, I can predict. Now, this is God. It's more than predict. He knows. But you do not know. Since you do not know, you cannot make judgment. I say, okay, God knows that I'm going to defy him. Why is he going to hold me responsible? Well, you didn't know because you made that decision. You didn't know what you were going to do, or you so to accuse God back in saying that he knew that this is what I'm going to end up by committing these things, and therefore I will be. Why is he holding me responsible? Since he knew knowledge by itself, in absence of action, does not bring judgment. What brings judgment is the actual action, and that, since you did not know and you have the ability and the capacity to choose, to make your choices, then that's where judgment and responsibility takes over.
Thank you. We have a lot of questions, so I'm going to try to get through these as soon as we can. Another question that was raised by one of the participants was, they asked, how do you justify apostasy laws in Islam because you mentioned in the talk of freedom of conscience in Islam that people are free, and don't these laws violate the principle of freedom of choice that you emphasize so much at the beginning of your talk? I mean, even the very idea that someone deserves death for not choosing Islam, isn't that even if you don't execute them, just having that idea, doesn't that
right? Very important question, and I think there has been plenty of studies, including one by Dr. Tawhid Al-Ariane, that completely disavows apostasy in Islam. There is no law against apostasy in Islam. They said there is absolutely unacceptable. It defies not only the Quranic principles and Tawheed principles, but it defies everything that we know about Islam, that people have. فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيُؤْمِنْ فَمَنْ شَاءَ فَلْيَكْفُرْ. This is a choice that God gave, that no one can take it from them. I think sometimes of course there's tradition also that we know what happened during Imam Ali and different other khulafa, in which certain people were punished by death because of certain things. So how do you reconcile these two things? There is a book that it's free on the internet with PDF that you can get and download by Dr. Tawhid Al-Ariane. It's called Apostasy in Islam. It's been well translated, very good translation, in which he disputes all these stories about people being killed because of their faith. I think the best they can do, and by the way, there are other people from Al-Azhar also that did, and I know, my son, he did the whole study also about apostasy, in which we can say that there is no punishment of death because of belief. I think Rashid al-Ghanouchi and others also wrote about this. What we have here is the possibility of what we call treason, which people could be punished not because of their relationship with God, but because of the relationship to their community. So an apostate is not someone who renounced religion, or someone who is no longer a Muslim or no longer a faithful, but someone who betrayed his community to the point that they will be harmed in a very grave way. And therefore that punishment not comes from his loss of that relationship with God, but with betraying his community. So if someone chooses not to practice, or chooses not to, he renounces religion, he's no longer a Muslim, he has every right to do that, because that's the right is given in the Quran. What is not his right is to start having a relationship, harmful relationship. They come and attack the religion of others. They come and try to make others not faithful. They go beyond simply a relationship with God by not believing. It becomes now into action, and that action is going to be harmful to the overall community. And that's, if there is a punishment, it would be related to that aspect of it, not to the aspect of whether he is a believer or she is a believer or not. And in that context, then we can say that there is no hadd al-ridda, that there is no this punishment of people who are apostates or renounce Islam. That there is not, that doesn't exist. What exists is that the possibility that if there is a harmful, and it has to be measured obviously, and it has to be discussed, there is a harmful aspect to that act, not his relationship to God, but to the community, in which there is a greater harm that's coming out of that, that's affecting the harmony and balance of the community. That's where a punishment could take place.
Thank you. There's two questions that are more technical in nature regarding theology. So one participant asked, what is your opinion about the concept of Tawheed according to the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya? Because they don't mention anything about this three conceptual triangular concept of Tawheed. And he says they don't mention about three concepts of Tawheed, like uluhiyya, rububiyya, and asma wa sifat. I'm not really sure I understand the second part of the question, but yeah, I mean, how do you contextualize your concept of Tawheed in terms of the long tradition of theology in Islam, especially amongst the Orthodox Sunni schools like the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya?
Well, again, I don't want to make this into a theological discussion, because it takes more than a few minutes to discuss this. And when we talk about Ash'ari and Maturidiyya, we have to understand the context by which the Ash'ari and the Maturidiyya, which they are very close conceptually. One is more Hanafi, the other is more tradition. And they came in response to Al-Mu'tazila. They came in response to certain challenges that this concept of how we conceptualize God, what is God's attributes, and the relationship between God and men. This is not something that came out of the era of the companions. The companions were very clear about this. They did not need someone to tell them what is Tawheed Rububiyyah, Tawheed Uluhiyyah, Tawheed Asma' wa Sifat, the existence of God. They didn't need any of that. These things came much later by scholars of theology in order to make it easier for people to conceptualize. However, somebody's saying the link is not working. I just got this message, so I don't know if someone, the producer, can work on this. But at any rate, what I'm trying to say here is that these things came later in response to certain challenges, and of course, I mean, people can discuss how we have to understand that 90% of the Muslims today adhere to this concept of Ash'ari about the nature of God and the relationship between God and man. I did not attempt to go through this. What I attempted to do in this presentation was to show the message of the Quran as far as what is Tawheed mean. That the Tawheed means that Allah is in one word and everything else is in different word. Now all the intricate conceptual relationships that the scholars discuss about, what does that mean? What is the qudra of God, the ability of God? What is the essence of God's attributes. When he had God's hand is, obviously it cannot be similar to human beings. Or we get God see, does that mean God see or does it know? All these are philosophical things. And I think most people understand these things. They don't have to go through details, and I think that's the way the companions and others understood it. And I think there are some people who go beyond. Sometimes they try to make these so controversial issues and so to make it so disruptive of people's lives, is that it takes from the essence of what Tawheed is about. And I think the best way to understand Tawheed really is to read the Quran, because it's so clear about what attributes God have and what kind of relationship God intends for people to have with him and with their fellow men and with the man and universe. I try to address it in that context because I think it's clearer from my perspective to many people of what the intention, what the will of God is as far as these interrelationships. I'm not saying this is the only way. I'm saying this is my way of explaining it.
Actually, that's right at the end of that answer, you covered another question, which was about, is there any agreement or consensus between theologians about anthropomorphism? Like, can you attribute human attributes to God? Like, nothing like laysa kamithlihi shay, and then there's another verse that talks about his breath, for instance.
Yeah, well, I mean, it's again, this
you
is
spoke about that. So
yeah. I mean, this is the material, the scholarship in these areas are so huge in Islamic discourse. So I mean, it's not for me to say, but I can tell you that certainly there is a huge consensus. There's a full consensus, ijma', that when we talk about God, we cannot make tashbih. We cannot say that, as you said, there is nothing similar to him. So if you talk about the hands of God, it's not like our hands, or the image of God is not like our image. That's what other communities, that our faith communities have gone through, and that's what God condemned, is that when they make a man as being God or a semi-God or a son of God, or has some kind of an attribute of a godly, divinely characteristic, that is a huge transgression on God's nature, and that's totally against the Tawheed. That there is nothing like him, period.
There was someone who raised a question about, you mentioned that before we were brought into this life that we were in a phase prior to this.
Yes.
Could you please talk a little bit more about that, and if you have any resources or something that they could...
Sure. This is in Surah Al-A'raf. This is Surah number 7, particularly in verse 172. In which God says that when the Lord drew forth from the children of Adam, from their loins, their descendants, and made them testify concerning themselves, saying, am I not your Lord, who sustains and cherishes you? And they said, yes, we witness. And that would come forth in the day of judgment. Now, how scholars understood this verse, very important verse, is that the people were not in vain, that they lived in this world of atoms, before we were formed and created the way we were, and that these things are our DNAs. These are the things that we are born with. This is our primordial nature. This is our fitra. Our fitra is that we believe, that we witness, that we adhered. But when we were created with this free choice, we may have made different choices, or we may have come back and followed our primordial nature. So in a nutshell, yes, this exists, and it does have a source in the Quran. So if you're a believer, you will believe in it. If you're not, then obviously you will not. Okay, I cannot hear. I lost the voice. I cannot hear your voice. Okay, either you're muted or I am muted. Who's muted here?
Sorry, I'm muted.
Okay.
So there were two questions regarding the relationship between man and man.
Yes.
One person asked, could you repeat the names of the principles that you said that? And another kind of clarificatory question. The second one was, qist. Did you mention anything about qist? Is this the same concept as harmony?
Justice.
Yes.
Yeah. Well, the relationship, the two principles that regulate the relationship between man and man is one is the tadafu', which I said how to check someone's power, aggression, relation, the type of engagement, and the second is shuhud, is how you're going to be a witness over that person. That a community could be a witness over other communities, a person could be a witness over others, and that means that always people could come and testify that this was the right way of doing things, and people have done it in the right way or the wrong way. Take an example. For example, today we see what's happening around the world. So we have nations that aggress against other nations, or nations that do certain things which are unacceptable, or vice versa, nations that do good things. There are certainly some people who would come, and that God bestowed in them the wisdom and the knowledge and the belief in which they can say this is the right thing and this is the wrong thing. No one can ever come and say we did not know. There will always be among the world a community of people who would come and say this was the right way to do it. No one could come in American politics. Let's take American politics as an example and said, why we have poor people? Well, we didn't know about them. No, you knew about the poor people. You made choices, policies that kept the poor poor and made the rich richer. So you cannot come and say we did not know. Or there are always some people who could come and actually testify to the truth. There will not be one time where everyone on earth is ignorant, is totally divulged of any knowledge of what the truth or what the right thing to do is. There will always be a community of people who would come and witness. And that's part of that natural relationship between man and man. There will always be people who know what the right thing is. The question is, will the people choose that right path, or will they just ignore it and go according to their whims and desires?
Thank you. I have a question here on the question of the problem of evil. So what's the relationship between your idea of Tawheed and how do you deal with evil? Actually, another participant along the same line had said, I think they said that if I want to quote them correctly, if Trump is Pharaoh, then who will be Musa? So I kind of feel like those two are related to each other.
Well, in the question of evil, certainly, first of all, we have to define what evil is. And certainly when we talk about from the Quranic point of view, from an Islamic point of view, God tells us what behavior is unacceptable and evil and must be avoided, and what behavior is good and must be followed, and what falls in between, that it is neither good or bad, depending on the circumstance, that in certain areas it could be good, in certain areas it could be harmful. But the things which are certainly evil, like killing people, all right, even with killing people, it's an evil act. But if you're defending yourself, that evil act may not be an evil act because you're defending. There's a higher principle here. So even if people are being aggressed upon, if there is an aggression from some people and they're trying to kill them and these people resisted, and by that form of resistance they had to kill somebody because they were resisting themselves, then that form may not be evil. But evil as a pure form of bad behavior is something that is very much known to humankind, and it's very much universal. People may differ on certain aspects, but many things are pretty much agreed on. That evil is a choice. It's not something that has been forced on people to do. So that choice then will have consequences. Now, when we talk about this is an evil act, could be an evil act from one perspective, but could be a good act or righteous act from another perspective. So which perspective do we take? If the US goes to Iraq, invades Iraq, and to them that this is a moral thing because they are bringing democracy, and this is to them is a moral act. Maybe from the other point of view that people look at this as being aggression. So who would be judging whether that evil act is an actual evil act or this act is a righteous act? Here God gives us, if we are going to adhere to his message, some principles by which we can exercise our judgment in order to decide, or in order to understand how God perceives these acts. But at the end, these are human acts. Now, if something bad happens to people, in their perspective, evil things are happening to them. Well, we can look at this in two ways. Either this is something that they brought upon themselves, and therefore they cannot blame God, they can blame themselves for having done that, and we have numerous examples. Or it is something that happens to them as part of that trial, that testing that God gives people to see the essence of these people. Because in that, God says people are tested. They could be tested with good things and bad things. If they are tested with bad things, the normal or the expected behavior is patience, that they are willing to take that and be patient, and this is how they will be rewarded. And if they're tested, and this is another test, ibtila could be good or bad. Ibtila doesn't mean bad. Could be tested with good things, and there it should be showing appreciation and gratitude towards God. And when that doesn't happen, then there will be also consequences to that. So in either way, whether people are tested with what they perceive, not necessarily what it is, what they perceive as good or bad is something that is related to their perception of good and evil, but the response is the same. The response is how you deal with your relationship to God, whether through patience and perseverance or through gratitude and appreciation.
We have just a few more minutes, 3 more minutes, so I will ask my questions that I had delayed until this point. I want to know, basically, what is the net difference? I mean, a world, like someone who believes in Tawheed and wants to see and defend the Tawheedi vision versus a non-Tawheedi world. I mean, don't we have advances in progress? And a lot of rights and justice, but not having to reference God at all. I mean, we can reference all kinds of other things. Why Tawheed? What makes the difference?
Well, very good question, actually, and I'll try to answer it in the few minutes remaining. When we talk about Tawheed, we talk about a different realm. We're talking about the Creator, God, the Transcendent, the most knowledgeable, the one who created life and created people and he knows their capacity, and therefore he gave them a path to follow. And he said, if you follow that path, you will live in the most balanced, harmonized, best life that you can do in the way it was intended. People could go independently and said, I know how to live the most harmonious life, and I don't need the assistance of God. Well, what happens here is that when people are left their own designs, then they may, because that's human nature. They have, we said this is limited knowledge, definite or finite amount of ability and capacity and knowledge and all that, then they may err. They may go the wrong way. It's not guaranteed that they will always follow the correct path. They will not guarantee that they will know what is right and what is balanced and what is just and so on and so forth, because that depends now simply on the power relationships among people. So if there are more powerful people within that system, they can impose on people what kind of lifestyle, what kind of laws they can live under, and therefore everybody has to conform. Otherwise, there will be a power struggle, and since they are more powerful, they will take over. On the other, in the other system, of the system of Tawheed, no one has that power. No one has that ability to impose on others their will, and therefore this will, which is the will of the majority, may not be in a way that could be harmful to the majority of the people. And there are numerous examples in today's world where we see that the majority of the people may choose a course of action that could be detrimental and harmful to many people, even some majorities in some societies, and people cannot do anything because there is no guide, there is no guidance, there is no limit to which they can say, who is the best judge. Mearsheimer writes in his book in International Relations, he said the first principle of international relations today, and this is where we have the powers, everybody is on his own, is that there is no frame of reference. We do not have, internationally speaking, a power that says, okay, we can adhere to that power and therefore everybody can relate to it. We don't have that. But in the principle of Tawheed, we do. There is a frame of reference when we can, there are certain things that are definite And there are certain things which are, definitely good, definitely bad, and somewhere in between. That there is a frame of reference. Now we can make ijtihads, we can exert our, our own thinking of how we understand these things, but they do exist. But if it is left to man, if it's left to the concepts of man, people could differ, and then it's whoever is going to manipulate or is more powerful to impose their own will, and that will not be justice. That will not be justice. That will be actually the meaning of transgression and oppression.
Thank you very much. At this point, Dr. Sami, I'd like to thank you. We have run out of time. I hope to invite you, everybody who participated, to our next lecture will be tomorrow, which is What the Coronavirus Teaches About Democracy and Authoritarianism by Nader Hashmi, who is from the University of Denver. But for now, I would like to sign off and thank Dr. Sami Al-Arian for his lecture on the kickstart of the Ramadan web series. I look forward to seeing all of you participate in the coming month. Thank you very much.
Thank you.